Four-Legged Loyalty is a channel that records true stories of loyalty from dogs' four-legged friends who have overcome all limits of strength and instinct to protect, accompany, and sometimes save people in the most extreme circumstances. These are not stories woven to impress or please viewers. They are slices of real life, told from the experiences of ordinary people and the dogs who have left a deep mark on them. Today, Four-Legged Loyalty brings a story that takes place in the deep forests of Catskill, New York, USA, a place where red maple forests, rugged trails, and unexpected rains test the loyalty of a German shepherd named Max and his companion, Corporal Ethan Sullivan. This is 2 Days in the Woods, the Sheepdog and the Soldier Who Lived, a story of simple friendship, unwavering loyalty, and survival on the edge of life and death. Ethan Sullivan is a 28-year-old corporal in the U.S. Army, stationed at a temporary base near the Catskills, about 100 miles northwest of Albany. He is not a standout among the hundreds of soldiers on base, 6 feet tall, trim but not overly muscular, with light brown hair cropped short in a military style and green eyes that always have a thoughtful look that hides a sadness he never speaks of. His face is tanned from days of outdoor training, with a few faint lines at the corners of his eyes, remnants of running on dirt roads in the Catskills and nights sleeping outdoors in the woods. Ethan comes from a small town called Coxsackie, near Albany, where red maple forests in the fall, winding dirt roads running along the Hudson River, and peaceful afternoons sitting on the riverbanks defined his childhood. His family was not wealthy, living in a small wooden house with a red tile roof and an old fireplace, where his father, Robert Sullivan, was a carpenter and his mother, Margaret, worked at the town hardware store. Ethan was an only child. He grew up in the woods near Coxsackie, often jogging miles down the dirt roads in his old sneakers and his father's pale blue jacket, letting the cold of winter and the damp of spring seep into his skin. He was not a good communicator, preferring the quiet of nature to the loud chatter of the town. When he was 19, his parents died in a car accident on a slippery road near Albany, leaving him alone with a small wooden house and a few mementos, a wooden table his father had built himself, and a family photo taken by the Hudson River the summer he was 10. After his parents died, Ethan fell into a deep loneliness. He worked part-time at a repair shop in Coxsackie, working under forklifts, fixing tires and changing oil, but he felt that his life had no purpose, just a repetitive cycle from which he could not escape. One winter afternoon, while jogging through the woods near Coxsackie, Ethan stopped at a small coffee shop and saw a recruitment poster hanging on the wall, "Join the Army, build your future." The words were a flash in his mind, rekindling the desire for a stable life that he had nurtured since childhood. When his father told him about the soldiers of the Vietnam War he admired in books and newspapers. 2 months later, he packed his father's old backpack, an olive green one with frayed straps, a few clothes, his father's small folding knife, and a family photo taken by the river, and headed for the recruiting center in Albany. He didn't say much as he left Coxsackie. He just stood in front of the cabin, took one last look, and walked away without looking back. When he arrived at Fort Drum in 2022, Ethan was assigned to a patrol unit in the Catskills, about 100 miles northwest of Albany. The temporary base was a small area surrounded by a wire mesh fence, with tin-roofed shacks and dirt roads running through maple trees. He wore an olive green uniform, a cap, and carried an M4 rifle, but he wasn't the best soldier on the team. He wasn't as agile as some of his comrades, nor did he have the shooting skills to be praised. But Ethan had one thing no one could deny: endurance. He could hike for hours on rough trails in the rain without complaining, and he could sit still on cold nights to observe without losing focus. He carried his father's folding knife in his pocket, not for protection, but as a reminder of Coxsackie, of the days he thought he would never leave. Max came into Ethan's life one afternoon in April 2023, nearly a year into his stay at Fort Drum. Max was a German shepherd, a puppy from the training center in Lackland, Texas, where dogs were carefully selected for military service. Max was not the largest of his litter, weighing in at about 80 pounds and standing nearly 26 inches at the shoulder, but he stood out for his intelligence and his discipline. Max's coat was thick and black and brown, groomed to withstand the chill of the Catskill forest and the mud of the trails. His ears were always upright, alert to every sound, from the wind whistling through the trees to the distant roar of a jeep. His bright brown eyes gleamed with a sharp, determined look, as if he always knew exactly what to do. Max was trained to patrol and search, a necessary duty in the Catskills, where remote trails sometimes posed a threat from inclement weather or trespassers. The first time Ethan met Max, he was standing in the Fort Drum training yard, in the weak light of a spring afternoon. The training yard was a large area, surrounded by wire fencing and maple trees, with the ground covered in dry grass and scattered rocks. Max was led from his kennel by a trainer named Mike, a man of about 38 with short black hair and hands tanned from years of working outdoors. Mike wore an olive green military shirt, put a black nylon collar around Max's neck, and told Ethan that Max was a good dog but needed a patient handler. Ethan looked at Max, sensing the wariness in his eyes. He took his time. He walked slowly, kneeling about 3 feet away from Max, and placed his hand on his head. Ethan's hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from a strange sense of connection. Max sniffed his hand, tilted his head, and then sat down suddenly, his eyes looking straight at Ethan as if accepting him from that moment on. Mike laughed, patted Ethan on the shoulder, and told him that Max had chosen him. Ethan and Max became inseparable. Every morning, as the first light of dawn broke through the maple trees, Ethan took Max on a patrol around the area, checking the trails leading into the makeshift base in Catskill. He would throw an old tennis ball, a worn, muddy one, for Max to chase, watching him run with strong strides, his muscles clearly visible under his fur. There were days when Ethan sat on a wooden bench in the camp, reading an old book like The Call of the Wild or jotting down random thoughts in a small notebook, and Max would lie down next to him, his head resting on his front paws, his eyes half closed but alert. Ethan didn't say much, but he would whisper short sentences to Max. "You did great today," or "You're my best friend, you know that?" He didn't know if Max understood them, but every time he spoke, Max would raise his head, looking at him with bright eyes as if to respond. To Ethan, Max was more than just a service dog. He was a companion, a part of the family he'd lost when his parents died. There were nights when Ethan lay in his bunk in the camp, a small room with wooden walls, a folding bed, and an old table. He thought about his parents, about his childhood, and felt a hollow loneliness. He remembers afternoons jogging through the woods near Coxsackie, listening to the wind whistling through the trees, or sitting by the fire with his father, the smell of wood smoke in the air. But every time he looks down at Max, curled up on an old blanket next to the bed, breathing steadily, he feels comforted. Max is more than just a dog. He is the motivation for Ethan to keep going, to believe that life is still worth cherishing. The story that Four-Legged Loyalty wants to tell today is not just about Ethan and Max, but also about an unexpected challenge that tested their loyalty. It took place on a November morning in 2024, when Ethan and Max participated in a routine training session deep in the Catskills. The mission seemed simple, patrolling a 20 kilometers wide area of forest to check the security of the area. But a sudden downpour left Ethan missing, and Max, with unwavering loyalty, stayed behind to search for him for 2 days deep in the woods. This is not a fictional story. It is based on Army reports, on accounts of men on patrol, and on Ethan's own scribbles in his notebook after he recovered. This is 2 days in the woods, the sheepdog and the soldier who lived. Ethan Sullivan, who goes by Ethan, isn't a big talker, and if someone asks him where he's from or why he joined the Army, he'll usually respond with a simple, "From Coxsackie," wanting to find a way. But behind that reticence lies a long story about growing up in Coxsackie, a small town near Albany, New York, where life seems to revolve around red maple trees in the fall, winding dirt roads along the Hudson River, and peaceful afternoons sitting on the riverbank watching the water flow. Coxsackie isn't a place where people dream big. It's a place where people live slowly, work hard, and rarely leave in search of a different life. Ethan was born into a working-class family, neither rich nor poor. His father, Robert Sullivan, was a carpenter with rough hands, blackened by the sap of the wood, and light brown hair that had turned gray at the temples from years of hard labor. His mother, Margaret, was a gentle woman who worked in a small hardware store in the center of town, where she stood behind the counter, selling pans, lamps, and gardening tools to the locals. Ethan was an only child. He grew up in the woods near Coxsackie, jogging down the dirt roads in his father's old sneakers and pale blue jacket, letting the winter chill and spring dampness seep into his skin. He was not a star student at Coxsackie Athens High School, but he was always tenacious. He loved to run alone through the maple woods, listening to the wind whistling through the trees, the smell of damp earth and dead leaves filling his nostrils. He didn't attend the weekend football games or hangouts that the Coxsackie kids loved. He just ran, thought, and searched for some meaning in his life that he couldn't quite figure out. When he was 19, his parents died in a car accident on a slick road near Albany. They were on their way home from a shopping trip in the city. A truck had lost control and crashed into their car in a downpour. Ethan got the news from the police while sitting in the cabin by the old fireplace, and he just sat there, watching the fire burn, feeling an unfillable void. After his parents died, Ethan fell into loneliness. He kept the family's small cabin, a one-story house with a red-tiled roof, weathered wood walls, and an old fireplace in the living room, but it no longer felt like home to him. He started working part-time at a Coxsackie auto repair shop, standing under forklifts, fixing tires and changing oil, his hands black with motor oil, the way his father had worked with plastic. But he hated feeling trapped in a repetitive life, a life where he felt like his parents, working themselves to exhaustion and leaving behind nothing but an old wooden house and a few mementos. He missed afternoons sitting by the fire with his father, listening to him talk about his carpentry days, about the tables he'd built that he was proud of, or sitting on the banks of the Hudson with his mother, listening to her talk about small dreams like opening a flower shop in town. Ethan didn't want to live like that. He wanted to find a path, a clearer purpose. One day, while jogging through the woods near Coxsackie, Ethan stopped at a small roadside cafe and saw a recruitment poster hanging on the wall, "Join the Army, build your future." The words lit a small fire in his mind, awakening the desire for a stable life that he had nurtured since childhood. When his father told him about the soldiers in the Vietnam War that he admired in books and newspapers. 2 months later, he packed his father's old backpack, an olive green one with frayed straps, containing a few changes of clothes, his father's small folding knife, and a family photo taken by the Hudson River, and set off for the recruiting center in Albany. He didn't say much as he left Coxsackie. He stood in front of the cabin, took one last look at it, felt the winter chill seep through his coat, and walked away without looking back. When he arrived at Fort Drum in 2022, Ethan was assigned to a patrol unit in the nearby Catskills, about 100 miles northwest of Albany. The temporary base was a small area surrounded by wire mesh fences, with tin roof shacks and dirt roads through maple forests. He wore an olive green uniform, a cap, and carried an M4 rifle, but he wasn't the most accomplished soldier on his team. He wasn't as agile as some of his comrades, nor did he have the shooting skills to be praised. But Ethan had one thing no one could deny: tenacity. He could hike for hours on rugged trails in the rain without complaining, and he could sit still on cold nights to observe without losing focus. He carried his father's folding knife in his pocket, not for protection, but as a reminder of Coxsackie, of the days he thought he would never leave. Max came into Ethan's life one afternoon in April 2023, when he had been at Fort Drum for almost a year. Max was a German Shepherd transferred from the training center in Lackland, Texas, where dogs were carefully selected for military service. Max was not the largest of his litter, weighing about 80 pounds and standing nearly 26 inches from paw to shoulder, but he stood out for his intelligence and his discipline. Max's coat was thick and black and brown, groomed to withstand the cold of the Catskill forest and the mud of the trails. His ears were always upright, alert to every sound, from the wind whistling through the trees to the distant roar of a Jeep engine. His bright brown eyes gleamed with a sharp, steady gaze, as if he always knew exactly what he was doing. Max was trained to patrol and search, a necessary duty in the Catskills, where remote trails sometimes posed a threat from inclement weather or trespassers. The first time Ethan met Max, he was standing in the Fort Drum training yard, in the weak light of a spring afternoon. The training yard was a large area, surrounded by wire fencing and maple trees, with the ground covered in dry grass and scattered rocks. Max was led from his kennel by a trainer named Mike, a man of about 38 with short black hair and hands tanned from years of working outdoors. Mike wore an olive green military shirt, put a black nylon collar around Max's neck, and told Ethan that Max was a good dog but needed a patient handler. Ethan looked at Max, sensing the wariness in his eyes. He didn't rush. He walked slowly, kneeling about 3 feet away from Max, and placed his hand on his head. Ethan's hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from a strange sense of connection. Max sniffed his hand, tilted his head, then sat down suddenly, his eyes looking straight at Ethan as if accepting him from that moment on. Mike laughed, patted Ethan on the shoulder, and told him that Max had chosen him. Ethan and Max became inseparable from then on. Every morning, as the first light of dawn broke through the maple trees, Ethan took Max on patrol around the area, checking the trails leading into the makeshift base in Catskill. He would throw an old tennis ball, a worn, muddy one, for Max to chase, watching him run with strong strides, his muscles clearly visible under his fur. There were days when Ethan sat on a wooden bench in the camp, reading or writing something in his notebook, and Max would lie down next to him, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed but alert. Ethan didn't say much, but he would often whisper short sentences to Max. "You were great at finding your way today," or "You're my best friend, you know that?" He didn't know if Max understood what he said, but every time he spoke, Max would raise his head and look at him with bright eyes, as if he wanted to respond. Max was more than just a service dog to Ethan. He was his companion, the part of the family he had lost when his parents died. There were nights when Ethan lay in his bunk in the camp, a small room with wooden walls, a folding bed, and an old desk. He thought about his parents, about his childhood, and felt a hollow loneliness. He remembered afternoons spent jogging through the woods near Coxsackie, listening to the wind whistling through the trees, or sitting by the fire with his father, the smell of wood smoke wafting through the air. But every time he looked down at Max, curled up on an old blanket next to his bed, breathing steadily, he felt comforted. Max was more than just a dog. He was Ethan's motivation to keep going, to believe that life was still worth cherishing. One November morning in 2024, Ethan Sullivan and Max were on a routine training mission in the deep Catskills woods, about 10 miles northwest of their temporary base. The mission was not unusual for Ethan's patrol unit. They were regularly sent out to patrol the local woods, ensuring the security of the small base nestled among the red maples and rugged trails, where the dangers of inclement weather and trespassers were always present. But as Ethan stood in the base's courtyard, watching the jeeps lined up for departure, he felt a vague unease creeping in. Perhaps it was the chill of the fall morning, when the temperature was only 6 degrees Celsius 43 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air carried the scent of dry leaves and damp earth from the surrounding woods. Or maybe it was the look in Max's eyes, his German shepherd who always walked beside him. As he lifted his head to look at him, his ears pricked as if sensing something he couldn't see. Ethan wore an olive green uniform, designed to blend into the forest landscape, with a thick waterproof jacket, moisture-wicking pants, and brown leather boots covered in dried mud from past patrols. He wore an olive green cap, the brim frayed from sweat and rain, and a pair of small goggles to protect his eyes from the branches and cold wind that whipped across the trails. Over his shoulder, he carried a small backpack containing the essentials: a scuffed plastic water bottle, a pack of dry rations, a small first aid kit with bandages and antiseptic, and the notebook he kept with him, where he jotted down his scattered thoughts about life in the Catskills. At his side was an M4 rifle, the sling frayed at the edges, but he was not a soldier who relied on his weapon. He relied more on his endurance and his ability to see than on bullets. Ethan was not a showman. He did not carry the fancy gadgets of some of his comrades, who favored GPS watches or noise-canceling headphones, because for him, simplicity was a way to keep his mind focused. Max, as always, walked beside Ethan. The 80-pound German shepherd had thick, well-groomed black-brown fur to protect him from the Catskills' cold and the mud that had accumulated there. Max wore a black nylon collar with a small metal tag bearing his military identification number, M7429. Max's ears were erect, his bright brown eyes were alert, and his steps were strong and sure as he walked across the leaf-strewn grounds of the base. Ethan looked at Max, feeling a strange sense of comfort. He knew that Max was more than just a working dog. He was a companion he could count on in any situation, especially in a place like the Catskills, where every step could lead to an unexpected challenge. Before getting into the car, Ethan knelt down and stroked Max's head, feeling the dry but soft fur under his hand, covered in mud from previous patrols. He didn't think much of it, but he felt that having Max by his side was enough to face whatever was coming. Ethan's patrol consisted of 5 men, all experienced soldiers, trained to face the dangers of the deep woods. The team leader was Sergeant John Carter, a 34-year-old man with short black hair, a rugged face tanned by time spent outdoors, and piercing brown eyes that watched everything with caution. Carter was stern but dedicated, always putting the safety of the team first, and he had a leadership style that inspired confidence, though he was sometimes quiet to the point of being cold. The other members of the team included Private First Class Ryan Hayes, a tall, lean, blonde-haired, cheerful young man of 22 who carried a lighter engraved with his father's name, Corporal Laura Kim, a petite but agile 27-year-old woman who was good at reading maps and navigating, and 2 other soldiers, Tom Rivera and Emily Brooks, both in their 30s, quiet and specialized in communications or survival techniques. The team was fully equipped: paper maps, handheld signal detectors, walkie-talkies, flashlights, and some survival items such as drinking water, dry food, and a small tarp to use if they had to stay overnight. The trip began around 8 a.m. as the sun peeked through the maple trees, casting a pale yellow light through the thick autumn morning fog. The team traveled in 2 military jeeps, olive green, and with large tires designed to handle the rugged terrain of the Catskills. Ethan sat in the back seat of the second vehicle, next to Laura, while Max curled up at his feet, his head resting on his paws, his ears perked up as the road creaked. The road from the base to the mission's starting point was a long one, through maple forests with red and yellow leaves, past streams that trickled under dry leaves, and through trails that were damp from previous rains. Ethan looked out the window, saw the dew on the leaves glistening in the weak light, and his unease grew more pronounced. He didn't know why he felt that way, but he tried to push it aside, telling himself that this was just a routine training exercise. When the team reached the mission's starting point, a clearing about 10 miles from the base, near a small, slow-moving stream, they got out of their vehicles and began to prepare. Their mission was to patrol a 12-mile stretch of forest that led deep into the Catskills, an area that had been suspected of being unsettled by reports from other units of wildlife activity or illegal poachers. Carter stood in front of the team, map in hand, and explained the plan. "We're going to walk through this area, checking each section for signs of anomalies. Max will go ahead and look for anything suspicious. If there's any sign of danger, retreat to the vehicle. The weather is cold today, with a chance of rain. Stay hydrated and focused." Ethan listened, nodding, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He looked down at Max, who stood still, his ears pricked higher, as if sniffing the damp forest air. The team set out around 8:30 a.m. Leaves rustled beneath Ethan's boots as they left the clearing, and the morning chill seeped through his jacket, making him shiver. The temperature was about 5 degrees Celsius, 41 degrees Fahrenheit, and the ground was damp from the night dew that had not yet melted. Ethan walked near the front of the team, with Max as usual. He walked at a steady pace, his boots leaving faint footprints in the dry leaves, which were quickly covered by the wind. Max walked beside him, his nose constantly sniffing the ground, his eyes alert, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the air as if searching for something. The team moved in silence, the only sound being their footsteps and steady breathing in the silence of the deep forest. Ethan could feel sweat beginning to seep through his undershirt, even though the air was still cold, and he knew it was a sign of his inner tension. As the team moved deeper into the Catskills, the landscape became wilder. The trail led through maple forests with leaves of fiery red and yellow, with dense undergrowth and moss-covered rocks scattered on either side. Low pines and old oaks grew densely, casting patches of dappled shade on the ground. Ethan looked up through the gaps in the canopy, seeing the sun a little higher, but the light was filtered through the thick clouds, making it seem hazy. He turned to look at Max, who paused for a moment, his head raised, ears pricked higher, his nose sniffing the humid air. He thought to himself that Max might sense something was wrong too, but he wasn't sure what. Around 9 a.m., when the team had gone nearly 3 miles, they entered a narrower section of the trail, flanked by steep slopes of dry leaves and damp earth. The path was less than 5 feet wide, and the ground was slippery with wet leaves and tangled roots. Ethan felt the chill grow more acute, as if the air were trapped between the slopes, and a claustrophobic feeling began to rise in his stomach. He looked at Max, who was more focused than ever, his nose sniffing the ground, his ears pricked to the max. He felt a greater unease than ever, but he had no time to think about it. Little did he know that in a few minutes a sudden downpour would come, and his life would change forever. As Ethan Sullivan's patrol pressed deeper into the narrow trail between the low slopes of the Catskill forest, the chill of the November morning was still all around. The temperature hovered around 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius, and the humid air carried the scent of dry leaves and soft earth from the previous night's dew that drifted through the canopy of red and yellow maple trees. The trail, less than 5 feet wide, was slippery with wet leaves and tangled roots, forcing Ethan to tread carefully with each step. He wore an olive green uniform, a thick waterproof jacket that had absorbed some of the dew from the air, moisture-wicking pants caked with dry soil, and brown leather boots that left faint footprints in the dry leaves. Sweat was beginning to seep through his undershirt, and even though the temperature was still cold, he felt a little stifled under his frayed cap. A small backpack on his shoulder held water, rations, and a notebook, and the M4 rifle hung from his waist, the strap rubbing against his neck as he moved. But he paid it no mind. The unease in his heart outweighed any discomfort from the equipment or the weather. Ethan walked near the front of the team, with Max, his German shepherd, always his trusty companion. Max walked with sure steps, his thick black-brown fur matted with dry leaves and dirt from the road, but his erect ears and bright brown eyes still gleamed with constant alertness. Max's black nylon collar, with its metal tag bearing the number 7429, vibrated slightly as he moved, and his nose sniffed the ground constantly, searching for any sign of danger. Ethan looked at Max, feeling a small comfort amid the cold and the growing tension in his heart. He knew that Max was more than just a working dog. It was his second set of eyes and ears, a creature that could detect things that humans couldn't. But even Max's presence couldn't completely dispel the unease he carried with him since leaving the base, a sense that something was waiting for them ahead, hidden beneath the maple trees and the tangled undergrowth. The patrol had traveled nearly 3 miles since leaving the clearing, and the narrow path they were on was a narrow path, flanked by low slopes, about 7 feet high, with a surface of dry leaves, wet dirt, and loose rocks. The ground beneath Ethan's feet was slippery, with small stones rolling under the soles of his shoes, and the wet leaves formed a treacherous carpet, hiding the bumps and hollows beneath. The tight space made Ethan feel claustrophobic, as if the slopes were closing in around him, and the cold from the ground seeped through his uniform, making him shiver. He looked up at the sky through the gaps in the canopy, seeing only the faint light of the sun filtered through the thick clouds, creating weak streaks of light on the ground. He turned to look at Max, who paused for a moment, raising his head to sniff the air, his ears perked up, as detecting something unusual. Ethan felt his heart beat faster, but he had no time to think about it. Only seconds later, as the team took a few steps into the narrow path, a heavy rainstorm suddenly came. It came on quickly like a curtain of water, covering the team's vision for a moment, turning the surrounding landscape into a hazy world where the trees were only vague silhouettes and the wild bushes disappeared in the thick rain. The air became heavy and cold, and the rain ran in rivulets across the ground, making the dry leaves more slippery than ever, with the temperature dropping to around 4 degrees Celsius 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Ethan felt his breath hitch, not from the cold, but from the suddenness of the situation. He slowed down, raising his hand to check his distance from Max, but in that moment, he slipped on a layer of wet leaves covering the rocks. He fell forward, his balance lost, and in his attempt to cling to the slope beside him, he failed to notice a deep ravine hidden under the wet soil and dry leaves. He fell into the ravine, about 5 meters 16 feet deep, a natural cave created by years of rain erosion, now covered by landslides and tangled tree roots. Ethan hit his head hard on a sharp rock inside the ravine, blood gushing from a gash on his forehead, and his left arm snapped under his weight, pinned under a large chunk of rock. He blacked out instantly, his body immobile in the darkness of the ravine, with his small backpack torn off at one corner and his M4 rifle dropped, lying a few feet away in the wet soil. Max, who was fortunately a few steps ahead of Ethan, was not affected by the fall, but the dog barked frantically when he realized Ethan had disappeared into the heavy rain. Max's bark echoed through the deep forest, full of panic and despair, as if he was calling Ethan back. The dog ran to the edge of the ravine, claws scratching at the damp soil and wet leaves, trying to dig down to find him, but the landslide and tangled roots prevented it. Max kept scratching, leaving scratches on the soil, but it could not penetrate. Max's bright brown eyes were red from the rain and cold wind, and his black-brown fur was wet from the humid air, but he did not care. In his mind, there was only one goal: to find Ethan. The patrol, separated by the sudden heavy rain, fell into chaos. The rain not only obscured their vision but also disoriented them, making it impossible for them to accurately determine each other's location. Sergeant John Carter, the squad leader, was about 10 feet away from Ethan when he fell, but the rain was so heavy that he could see nothing but the faint outlines of his comrades. He shouted into his radio, his voice muffled by the sound of rain and running water, "Sullivan, where are you? Report now." But there was no response. Ethan's radio in his backpack had been buried in the dirt when he fell, and the signal had been lost. Carter turned to see the other members of the squad, Ryan Hayes, Laura Kim, and the rest, trying to regroup in the rain, their hands clutching their rifles, their eyes alert for any sound around them. Max continued to bark, his bark echoing in the gully, but no one on the squad could get close enough to check. The rain was so heavy that they could see only a few feet ahead, and the slippery ground made every step a risk. Carter knew it was too dangerous to stay here, not only because of the rain, but also because of the rugged terrain and the possibility of getting stuck in a downpour that would last for a long time. He ordered over the radio, "Retreat to the car immediately. Call for backup on signal." The team began to move back down the trail, keeping a tight formation to avoid getting lost, but Max refused to follow. Ryan Hayes, the closest to Max, ran up, grabbed the dog's nylon collar, and tried to pull him away, but Max growled, yanked on the leash, and ran back to the edge of the ravine, barking incessantly. Carter looked at Max, saw the determined look in his eyes, but he had no choice. He ordered the team to retreat without Max, knowing they needed to survive to call for help. The team left the area, leaving Max alone in the rain and cold, with the sound of water rushing through the trees and the wind whistling through the deep woods. Ethan lay unconscious at the bottom of the ravine, his body shaking from the trauma, blood from the gash on his forehead running down his cheek, drying in red streaks on his tanned skin. He didn't know that the team had retreated, didn't know that the sound of rain and running water was covering the Catskill forest above, and didn't know that Max was at the edge of the ravine, determined not to leave. In the darkness of the ravine, a small gap between the rock and the earth allowed rainwater to seep in, carrying a bit of moisture from the earth, keeping him breathing, albeit feebly. His backpack lay scattered beside him, his notebook out, open to the last page he'd written, "Cold today, but beautiful woods." He didn't have the strength to wake up, didn't have the strength to call out to Max, but in his daze he thought vaguely of the dog, hoping that Max was safe with the team. On the ground, Max didn't care about the cold or the heavy rain. It stood at the edge of the ravine, claws digging into the damp earth, leaving deep scratches that it couldn't dig through. Its barks were getting weaker as the cold dried its throat, but it didn't stop. Max knew Ethan was down there, and it wouldn't leave until it found him. Its fur was wet from the rain, its eyes red from the wind and exhaustion, but its gaze was steady, as if to say it would never give up. Max stood there, alone in the Catskills, in the rain and the cold, waiting, against all odds, as a testament to its loyalty to Ethan, a loyalty that would lead to an emotional journey in the days ahead. After Ethan Sullivan fell into a ravine during a sudden downpour in the Catskills, the patrol was forced to retreat, leaving Max, the faithful German shepherd, alone in the cold and damp. The heavy rain did not subside immediately after the team left. It continued to pour down on the area in a torrential curtain, blurring the outlines of the red and yellow maple trees, the tangled bushes, and the slippery trail the team had just traversed. The daytime temperature hovered around 4 degrees Celsius, 39 degrees Fahrenheit, and the chilly air carried the scent of damp earth and wet leaves, drowned out by the sound of the rain. Max stood at the edge of the ravine where Ethan had disappeared, his ears erect, his bright brown eyes now red from the rain and wind, but his gaze never wavering. He barked incessantly, echoing through the trees, weakened by his parched throat, but Max paid no attention. In its mind, there was only one goal: to find Ethan, a companion it had chosen to be faithful to since the day they first met. 2 days had passed since Ethan had fallen, and Max had remained at the edge of the ravine, braving the cold of the day and the bitter cold of the night when the temperature dropped to 2 degrees Celsius, 36 degrees Fahrenheit, making its body shiver under its sodden fur. The Catskill forest was unforgiving to any living creature, and Max had no water or food to sustain him other than the rainwater he licked from the leaves. Its thick black-brown fur, once carefully groomed to protect against the cold of the forest and the mud from the trails, was now covered with damp earth and dry leaves, matted in patches, exposing the emaciated body underneath. Its ears were still erect, but one was slightly scratched from hitting a tree root in its relentless digging efforts. The bright brown eyes, once intelligent and determined, were red and dim from the rain, the cold, and exhaustion, but they still stared at the dirt covering the crevice, as if they could see through it to Ethan below. Max clawed at the ground, leaving deep scratches in the damp soil and tangled roots, occasionally drawing blood where his claws made contact with sharp rocks hidden beneath the surface. He tried to dig through more than 3 feet of dirt to get to Ethan, but the cold hardened the ground, and every time Max dug a little, rainwater flowed down, covering his efforts. Max did not give up. He stopped, panting, his breath forming tiny clouds in the cold air, then clawed again, as if driven by some deep instinct, an instinct of absolute loyalty to Ethan. Its legs trembled with cold and exhaustion. The lean muscles that had once propelled it along the trails around the base now shriveled from lack of water and nourishment. Max ate nothing but a few dry leaves it accidentally swallowed when sniffing the ground, and it drank nothing but the rainwater that had collected on the leaves. Its red eyes stared at the dirt, and its barks grew weaker by the day, drowned out by the rustle of rain and the rush of water through the trees in the deep forest. But Max didn't care about hunger, thirst, or the cold that was slowly robbing it of its life force. It only knew that Ethan was down there, and it had to stay to save him. Down in the ravine, Ethan lay in the suffocating darkness, his body immobile after a terrible fall from the heavy rain. He woke up after a few hours of unconsciousness, his mind hazy, not knowing how long he had been there. The pain from his broken left arm spread throughout his body, and every time he tried to move, he had to grit his teeth to keep from screaming in pain. A gash on his forehead, where he had hit the rock when he fell, left dried blood streaking his tanned face, and his green eyes were blurred with dehydration and exhaustion. The temperature in the crevice was slightly cooler than outside, about 3 degrees Celsius, 37 degrees Fahrenheit, but the stifling, oxygen-deprived air made it difficult for him to breathe. He survived because of a small gap between the rock and the ground, where rainwater seeped in, carrying moisture from the surface soil. He licked small drops of water from the rock, taking weak sips to keep himself from becoming completely dehydrated, but he knew that if he did not get help soon, he would not last much longer. In those dreamy hours, Ethan thought about Max. He remembered mornings at the base near Catskill, throwing old tennis balls for Max to chase around the training grounds, watching the dog run with strong strides, his muscles defined by his muddy black-brown fur. He remembered nights in the camp, Max curled up on an old blanket next to his bed, his ears perked up as he whispered to him about his days in Coxsackie. He remembered the way Max's eyes would light up when he looked at him, as if the dog understood everything he was not saying. He wondered if Max was safe, if he had followed the patrol to find shelter, or if he was still somewhere on the ground, waiting for him. He didn't know that Max was right above him, just a few feet away, but the dirt was thick. He whispered to himself with the last of his strength, "Max, where are you? If you're still alive, find me." But he didn't have the strength to scream, and his voice was drowned out by the oppressive silence in the ravine. On the ground, Max faced the cold, the falling rain, and the loneliness of the deep forest. A few times, there was a distant noise, maybe a deer moving in the bushes or an owl hoot in the night, but Max paid no attention to those dangers. He didn't think about the hunger, the thirst, or the cold that was slowly robbing him of his life. In his mind, there was only Ethan, the soldier who had knelt down and stroked his head when they first met, who had shared the cold patrols in the forest, who had become his family in this strange land. Max lay down on the edge of the ravine when the cold of the day became too much, curling up to keep some of his own warmth during the cold nights, but within minutes, he would be back up again, scratching and barking, as if refusing to rest. About 2 miles from the ravine, a group of local hunters living near a small village on the edge of the Catskills heard Max's faint bark echoing through the cold winds after the heavy rains had cleared on the second day. They were familiar with the forest, often hunting or helping with search and rescue missions in the fall to help those in need. A man named Carl, about 45 years old, a mechanic by trade but an avid hunter, stood on a low slope, listening to the distant barking, but he couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from in the morning mist. He thought it might be a stray dog, but he didn't dare venture too far into the woods, where tales of wild animals and missing people kept the locals cautious. He returned to the group's camp and sat by the fire, but he still felt a vague unease. He didn't know that the barking was from Max, a dog fighting cold, thirst, and death to save his master. Down the ravine, Ethan began to lose consciousness. He felt his body growing lighter, as if he were floating in an unknown space. He no longer felt the pain of his broken arm or the stifling cold. Everything became blurry, and his mind drifted to distant memories. He remembered afternoons jogging on the dirt roads of Coxsackie, when the autumn sunlight filtered through the maple trees, making them glow like red carpets in the countryside. He remembered sitting by the fire with his father, listening to the crackling of the logs and the smell of wet smoke in the air. He remembered mornings in the Catskills, when he and Max would patrol the base, the peace of watching the dog run along the leaf-covered trails. He thought that if he were to die here, at least he would have had those moments when he felt his life had meaning. But he didn't want to give up. "Max, if you're still there, find me," he whispered to himself. "I trust you." On the ground, Max didn't know that Ethan was losing hope. He didn't know that the patrol had retreated, that the rain was still falling in the deep woods, that no one would hear his barks over the rushing water and the cold wind. But Max didn't need to know. He wasn't acting on reason or logic. He was acting on instinct, on the loyalty that was deep in the heart of a German shepherd. Max stood there, at the edge of the ravine, a lone figure in the deep woods and wet leaves, determined and unyielding. He did not move, did not give up, even though his body was exhausted, even though the cold and the falling rain were slowly sapping his strength. Max knew Ethan was down there, and he would stay until he found him, or until he had no more strength left to go on. 2 days passed, and Max stood there, living testament to loyalty beyond all limits. He had no idea that the local hunting party would soon hear his barks, that his efforts would lead to an emotional journey of reunion. But Max didn't need to know that. To him, only one thing mattered: Ethan, his companion, his master, the one to whom he had chosen to be loyal since the day they first met. Max stood there, deep in the Catskills, waiting, hoping, and fighting, a German shepherd with a heart that would never give up. 2 days after Ethan Sullivan fell into a ravine during a sudden downpour in the Catskills, a patrol failed to return immediately to search for him. The torrential rain, combined with the rugged terrain and lack of communication from Ethan's buried radio, made initial efforts impossible. Daytime temperatures hovered around 4 degrees Celsius (39 degrees Fahrenheit), and the damp chill of the forest permeated the soil, dead leaves, and air, carrying the scent of damp earth through the trees. Ethan lay at the bottom of the ravine in the stifling darkness, his body immobile from his horrific fall. He had regained consciousness after several hours in a coma, but now he was drifting into a dreamlike state between life and death. The pain from his broken left arm and the laceration on his forehead had become only a dull ache, as if his body had given up on the pain. The sweat had stopped flowing because he was severely dehydrated, and his green eyes were half closed, blurred in the darkness. His breathing was weak in thin wisps that dissipated in the cold air, and he had no strength to move or call for help. He was kept alive by a small gap between the rocks and the ground where rainwater had seeped in, carrying moisture from the earth, but he knew his time was running out. On the ground, Max still stood at the edge of the ravine, a lone figure in the cold woods. 2 days had passed, and the 80-pound German Shepherd was now emaciated and exhausted, his thick black-brown fur matted with damp earth and dry leaves, matted in hard clumps. Max's ears were still erect, but one was slightly scratched, and his bright brown eyes were now red from the rain, the cold, and the fatigue. Its legs trembled, its claws bleeding from deep scratches from scratching the wet soil for 2 days without stopping, leaving small red streaks on the ground. Max had no water or food except for the rainwater that had collected on the leaves, and it stood there, braving the cold of the day and the cold of the night, waiting for Ethan. It barked incessantly, its barking growing fainter as the days passed, drowned out by the sound of the falling rain, but Max would not give up. It knew Ethan was down there, and it would not leave until it found him. After 2 days, as the heavy rain began to subside with the weaker winds and the pale light of the third morning, the rescue team from the temporary base near Catskill decided to return to the ravine. They had not been able to act sooner, as the heavy rain and treacherous terrain had made any previous attempts needlessly risky. But when the weather cleared, Sergeant John Carter, Ethan's patrol leader, resolutely led the rescue team back. Carter, a 34-year-old with short black hair, a tanned, angular face, and piercing brown eyes, could not forget the unwavering look in Max's eyes when the dog refused to leave the ravine 2 days ago. He knew that if Ethan was alive, Max would be the key to finding him. The 8-man rescue team, equipped with 2 military jeeps, high-powered headlights, digging tools like shovels and hose, and a medical kit for emergency first aid, left the base early Tuesday morning, when the temperature was still 5 degrees Celsius, 41 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sun was just breaking through the clouds, casting a pale yellow light through the lingering mist in the air. When the rescue team reached the ravine, they saw Max in the distance, a small but determined figure in the narrow path. Max stood there, almost motionless, his legs shaking with exhaustion, his fur matted with dirt and dead leaves, and a trail of dried blood running from his claws to the ground below. Carter, the leader of the team, stopped and looked at Max with amazement and emotion. He couldn't believe that the dog had been here for 2 days, in the cold and wet and pouring rain, without water or food. He walked closer, knelt down before Max, and noticed that the dog's red eyes were still shining steadily, as if pleading with him, "Ethan is here. Help me." Max had no strength left to bark loudly, only making weak, hoarse sounds, then shuffled to the edge of the ravine, pawing at the ground with his bleeding claws as if to show the rescue team where to dig. Corporal Laura Kim, a member of the patrol and now part of the rescue team, stood next to Carter, looking at Max with tears in her eyes. Laura, a petite but agile 27-year-old with black hair tied back in a tan, had worked with Ethan and Max on patrols. She knew the bond between them, and she felt a pang of pain at the thought that Ethan might not make it. But when she saw Max, she felt a glimmer of hope. She walked over, knelt beside him, and stroked his matted fur. She felt his thin, trembling body under her hands, and she knew that Max had sacrificed everything to stay here, waiting for Ethan. "If he's alive, it's because of you, Max," she whispered to herself. The rescue team moved quickly into position. They brought long steel shovels, iron picks, and a handheld air blower to clear the damp soil that covered the entrance to the ravine. Max, exhausted, trudged closer to the edge, clawing at the dirt with his weak claws, as if to help. Carter ordered the team to concentrate on digging in the area Max had indicated, where the dirt bore deep scratches from the dog's claws. He knew Max wasn't there for nothing. If Ethan was alive, he would be down there. The rescue team worked in silence, the only sounds being the shovels digging into the dirt, the picks breaking through the roots, and their labored breathing in the cold air. Max stood by, his legs shaking, but he didn't move. He looked at the rescue team with a steady gaze, as if pleading with them, "Hurry. He needs us." Ethan didn't know the rescue team had arrived down in the ravine. He had lost track of time, and his body was in critical condition. The temperature in the crevice was about 3 degrees Celsius, 37 degrees Fahrenheit, lower than outside, but the stuffy, oxygen-deprived air left him with only weak gasps. He licked the small drops of water from the soil that had seeped through the crevice, drinking sips to keep himself from becoming completely dehydrated, but he had no strength to eat or move. His backpack, torn apart when he fell, lay scattered beside him, and his notebook fell out, open to the last page he had written. "It's cold today, but the forest is beautiful." He had no strength to hold a pen, but he thought of Max, of the way his dog's eyes sparkled whenever he looked at him, and told himself that if Max were still alive, he wouldn't have abandoned him. He didn't know that Max was right above him, leading the rescue team to his rescue. The rescue team worked tirelessly for more than an hour in the cold morning air. They dug through the damp soil, breaking through the tangled roots, and finally found a narrow opening leading down into the ravine. Carter bent down, shining a powerful flashlight inside, and the light from the flashlight illuminated Ethan's pale face. He lay there, motionless, eyes half closed, breathing so weak he could barely see, with dried blood on his forehead and his left arm bent at an unnatural angle. Carter felt his heart sink, but he did not give up hope. He shouted to the team, "We found him! Hurry!" The rescue team quickly widened the entrance, using shovels in their bare hands to clear the dirt, creating a path large enough to pull Ethan up. Max, exhausted, trudged closer, looking down into the opening with a bright gaze. He had no strength left to bark, but he stood there waiting as if he knew Ethan was about to be rescued. Laura and a paramedic named Daniel, a man in his mid-30s with short brown hair and strong arms, climbed down into the ravine to check on Ethan. They wrapped him in a thermal blanket and checked his pulse and breathing. Daniel placed his hand on Ethan's neck, felt a faint pulse, and confirmed that he was alive, though in critical condition. "He's alive, but he's weak," he told Laura. "We need to get him out now." They carefully placed Ethan on a stretcher, strapping him in place to avoid further injury. When Ethan was pulled to the surface, the faint light of the sun filtering through the clouds illuminated his pale face, and the rescuers breathed a sigh of relief. He was alive, a miracle after 2 days trapped in the ravine in the cold and rain of the Catskills. Max shuffled over to the stretcher, bent down to sniff Ethan's face, his red eyes shining faintly but hopefully. Max was too weak to do anything more, but he was still there, next to Ethan, as if to make sure he was still alive. Carter looked at Max with admiration and emotion. He knelt down next to the dog, stroking its dirt-caked fur, feeling its trembling body beneath his hands. He knew that without Max, they would never have found Ethan in time. "You are a real fighter, Max," he whispered to himself. Laura wiped the rain from her face, not to clean it, but to hide the tears of emotion. She looked at Max, saw his emaciated body, his shaking legs, and his bleeding claws, and knew that the dog had sacrificed everything to save Ethan. She whispered to herself, "Thank you, Max. You did the unthinkable." The rescue team quickly treated Ethan on the spot. Daniel gave him 4 fluids, pumping warm saline solution to help his body fight dehydration. They examined his injuries, confirming that he had a broken left arm and a deep laceration to his forehead, but no signs of internal bleeding, a blessing given the circumstances. They placed a pad under his left arm to temporarily immobilize him, and wrapped a thermal blanket around his body to protect him from the cold. Ethan was still unconscious, but his breathing was gradually steadier, and his pulse was becoming more noticeable. The rescue team knew they needed to get him back to base immediately, where he could receive proper medical care, and then to a larger military hospital. As the rescue team prepared to load Ethan into the jeep and head back to base, Max trailed behind, never leaving Ethan's side. The dog was so exhausted he could barely walk, but he tried, his legs shaking, his claws leaving small trails of blood in the dirt. Laura looked at Max, feeling a pang in her heart. She knew Max needed medical attention, but she also knew he wouldn't leave Ethan until he was safe. Carter ordered the team, "Take Max with you. He's done enough. We'll take care of them both." Max had done his job, not with strength or skill, but with loyalty beyond measure. 2 days after Ethan Sullivan fell into a ravine during a sudden downpour in the Catskills, a rescue team from a nearby makeshift base camp returned with the faintest hope that he was still alive. The torrential rain had cleared by Tuesday morning, giving way to weak sunlight through thick clouds, but the damp November morning still hung over the area, with temperatures hovering around 5 degrees Celsius, 41 degrees Fahrenheit. The air carried the scent of damp earth and wet leaves, carried by a light wind that whistled through the maple trees, whose leaves were a mix of red and yellow. The 8-man rescue team, equipped with military jeeps, digging tools such as shovels and hoes and high-powered headlights, worked tirelessly for more than an hour to break up the damp soil covering the entrance to the ravine where Ethan was trapped. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a pale yellow light through the gaps in the clouds, glinting off the water droplets on the dry leaves, but not enough to dispel the chill that permeated the team's every breath. Max, the German shepherd who had been standing guard at the edge of the ravine for 2 days, was exhausted, his thin body shivering in the damp chill. His thick black-brown fur, once carefully groomed against the chill of the Catskill forest, was matted with damp earth and dry leaves, matted in hard, dry patches, revealing the prominent veins on his once lean body. Max's ears were still erect, but one was slightly scratched, and his bright brown eyes, once intelligent and determined, were red from the rain, the cold, and exhaustion. His legs trembled, and his claws bled from deep scratches where he had clawed at the damp earth for 2 days without rest, leaving small red streaks on the ground. Max stood there, almost motionless, but his eyes never left the rescue team, as if waiting for a miracle. He had no strength left to bark loudly, only weak, hoarse sounds, but he still trudged closer to the edge of the ravine, clawing at the ground as if to help, though each movement was an effort beyond his physical limits. Sergeant John Carter, the rescue team leader, stood near Max, watching the team work with a mixture of tension and hope. Carter, a 34-year-old man with short black hair, a sharp face tanned by long hours in the sun, and piercing brown eyes, had seen much loss in his years in the military. He was not an emotional man, but the sight of Max standing guard for 2 days without food or water, in the cold and pouring rain, had filled him with a deep respect. He looked down at the dog, saw its shivering body beneath its matted fur, and thought to himself, "If he's alive, you'll be a hero, Max." But he didn't dare to hope for too much. 2 days in the ravine in the cold and without water was a trial few could have survived, even for a soldier as tough as Ethan. At the bottom of the ravine, Ethan lay in the stifling darkness, his body almost motionless, his breathing so weak it was almost inaudible. He had lost track of time, and the 37 degrees Fahrenheit 3 degrees Celsius cold in the ravine, though cooler than outside, was still draining him. The pain from his broken left arm and the gash on his forehead were now only vague sensations, as if his body had become numb to the pain. Sweat no longer flowed because he was severely dehydrated, and his green eyes were half closed, blurred in the darkness. He survived by a small gap between the rock and the ground, where rainwater seeped in, carrying moisture from the surface soil. He licked the drops from the rock, drinking weakly to keep his body from becoming completely dehydrated, but he had no strength left to eat or move. In his daze, he thought of Max, remembered the dog's bright eyes whenever he looked at him, and whispered to himself with the last of his strength, "Max, if you're still there, find me." But he had no strength left to hope for more. On the ground, the rescue team finally broke through the damp dirt, covering the entrance to the crevice, after more than an hour of nonstop work. Sweat streamed down their faces, seeping through their olive-green uniforms, and dirt covered their arms and shoulders, but no one complained. They widened the narrow opening into an entrance large enough for one person to climb down, and Carter bent down, shining a high-powered flashlight inside. The light from the flashlight illuminated Ethan's pale face, highlighting the dried blood on his forehead and his dry, cracked lips. He lay there, motionless, eyes half closed, breathing so weak he could barely see, with his left arm bent at an unnatural angle and his right arm hanging limply in the damp dirt. Carter felt his heart sink. He wasn't sure if Ethan was still alive, but he wouldn't give up. "We found him." "Hurry," he shouted to the team, quickly getting into position, preparing to lift Ethan to the surface. Corporal Laura Kim and Medic Daniel, a man in his mid-30s with short brown hair and strong arms, volunteered to climb down the ravine to check on Ethan. Laura climbed down first, her hands shaking from the cold as she clung to the roots and the slippery, damp soil in the ravine. She knelt down next to Ethan, placing her hand on his neck to check his pulse. His pulse was weak, but still beating, a fragile sign of life. She felt a surge of hope, but she also knew that Ethan was in dire straits. She looked at his pale face, saw his dry lips and half-closed eyes, and felt a pang of pain. She had patrolled with Ethan, knew him to be a patient soldier who kept his cool in difficult situations, and she whispered to herself, "You have to live, Ethan. Max didn't abandon you, and neither will we." Daniel, who climbed down after Laura, carried a thermal blanket and a small medical kit. He checked Ethan's breathing, placed his hand on his chest to feel for him, and confirmed that he was alive though weak. "He's severely dehydrated, and his arm is badly broken," he told Laura. We need to get him out now. Laura and Daniel carefully placed Ethan on a stretcher, strapping him in with straps to avoid further injury. They wrapped him in thermal blankets, trying to protect his body from the cold while the rescue team above pulled the stretcher up. When Ethan was pulled to the surface, the pale sunlight shone on his pale face, highlighting the dried blood and cracked skin from dehydration. The rescue team breathed a sigh of relief to see him alive, a miracle after 2 days trapped in the cold, rain-soaked ravine of the Catskills. Max, exhausted, trudged over to the stretcher, bent down to sniff Ethan's face. The dog's red eyes lit up faintly, but hopefully, as if it knew Ethan had been saved. Max had no strength left to bark, but it placed its head on Ethan's hand, feeling the faint warmth of his body, and stood still beside him, as if to make sure he was still alive. Carter watched the scene, feeling a surge of emotion. He knelt down beside Max, stroking the dog's muddy fur, and feeling its trembling body under his hand. He knew that without Max, they would never have found Ethan in time. He thought to himself, "You did the unthinkable, Max." Laura, standing next to Carter, wiped the water from her face, not to clean it, but to hide the tears of emotion. She looked at Max, saw his thin body, his trembling legs, and his bleeding claws, and knew that the dog had sacrificed everything to save Ethan. She whispered to herself, "Thank you, Max. You are a true hero." The rescue team quickly treated Ethan on the spot. Daniel administered fluids through and for, pumping warm saline solution to help his body fight dehydration. They examined his injuries, confirming that he had a broken left arm and a deep laceration on his forehead, but no signs of internal bleeding, a blessing given the circumstances. They placed a pad under his left arm to temporarily immobilize him, and wrapped an additional layer of thermal blanket around his body to protect him from the intense cold. Ethan was still unconscious, but his breathing was gradually steadier, and his pulse was becoming more noticeable thanks to the saline solution. The rescue team knew they needed to get him back to base immediately, where he could receive proper medical care, and then to a larger military hospital. As the rescue team prepared to load Ethan into the jeep for the trip back to base, Max struggled to his feet and follow. The dog shuffled along, legs shaking, claws leaving small trails of blood in the dirt. He didn't have the strength to walk fast, but he tried anyway, as if he didn't want to leave Ethan's side for even a second. Laura looked at Max, feeling a pang in her heart. She pulled an old coat from her pack, an olive green military jacket, frayed at the cuffs, and wrapped it around Max to protect him from the cold. She stroked his head, feeling the dirt-caked fur beneath her hands, and saw his red eyes looking at her with determination. She knew Max needed medical attention, but she also knew he wouldn't leave Ethan until he was safe. "Put Max in the jeep, next to Ethan," Carter ordered the team. "He's done enough. We'll take care of both of them." Daniel and another member of the rescue team, Private First Class Ryan Hayes, a young man of 22 with light blonde hair and a cheerful disposition, carefully lifted Max up and placed in the jeep next to Ethan's stretcher. Max didn't protest. He was too weak to do anything but lie down. They wrapped Laura's coat tighter around Max and placed a small blanket over him to protect him from the cold wind coming through the car door. Max lay close to Ethan, his head resting on the edge of the stretcher, his red eyes watching him with determination. He didn't have the strength to bark or move, but he was there, next to Ethan, as if to make sure he was safe. Ethan, though he was still unconscious, felt a vague sense of confusion creep into his mind. He didn't know that the rescue team had found him, didn't know that Max had stood guard for 2 days to lead them here. But in his hazy dream, he saw Max, his eyes shining, standing in the leaf-covered depths of the forest, waiting for him. He felt a strange comfort, as if he knew the dog would never abandon him. That miraculous moment when Ethan was pulled from the ravine, alive after 2 days trapped in the cold and rain, was not only a miracle of survival, but also a testament to Max's unwavering loyalty, the German shepherd who refused to abandon his companion. When the rescue team from a makeshift base near Catskill pulled Ethan Sullivan from a deep wooded ravine, the damp chill of the November morning was still all around on the 3rd day since he went missing. The temperature hovered around 5 degrees Celsius, 41 degrees Fahrenheit, and a light breeze blew through the area, carrying moisture from the wet soil and dry leaves that clung to the red and yellow maple trees. Ethan lay unconscious on a stretcher, his face pale with dried blood streaking his forehead, his lips cracked from dehydration, and his weak breaths coming in thin wisps that dissipated in the chill air. The rescue team quickly wrapped him in a silver thermal blanket, administered fluids through and for to combat severe dehydration, and immobilized his broken left arm with a hard plastic pad and medical tape. But as they worked, Max, the German shepherd who had stood guard at the edge of the ravine for 2 days, creeped closer, never leaving Ethan's side. Max was a shadow of his former self. His thick black-brown fur, once carefully groomed against the chill of the Catskill forest, was matted with damp dirt and dry leaves, matted in dry clumps, revealing the thin, shivering body beneath. Max's ears were still erect, but one was slightly scratched, and his bright brown eyes, once intelligent and determined, were red from the rain, the cold, and exhaustion. His legs trembled, and his claws bled from deep scratches he had made in the damp dirt for 2 days without rest, leaving small red marks on the ground. Max had no strength to walk fast, but he crawled closer to Ethan's stretcher, bent down to sniff his face, as if to make sure he was still alive. As the rescue team laid Ethan on the ground to bandage him and prepare to load him into the jeep, Max lay close to the stretcher, using his body to shield Ethan from the cold wind that blew through the area. The rescue team looked at Max with awe and emotion. Sergeant John Carter, the team leader, stood nearby, watching the dog with sharp brown eyes that sparkled with respect. Carter, a 34-year-old man with short black hair and a tanned, angular face, had seen much in his military career, from dangerous patrols to inevitable loss. He was not an emotional man, but the sight of Max lying close to Ethan, using his thin body to shield him, made him feel a pang of pain. He looked at the dog's trembling body, at the dirt-caked fur and the dried blood on its claws, and knew that Max had sacrificed everything to save Ethan. No food, no water, no rest for 2 days in the cold and pouring rain. He knelt beside Max, stroking his dirt-caked fur, feeling the thin, shaking body beneath his hands. "You did what none of us could," he thought. "You are a true warrior." Corporal Laura Kim, a member of the rescue team, stood next to Carter, looking at Max with tears in her eyes. Laura, a petite but agile 27-year-old with black hair tied back in a tan, had patrolled with Ethan and Max on many missions in the Catskills. She knew the bond between them, and she felt a deep emotion when she saw Max lying close to Ethan, using her body to shield him from the cold wind. She knelt down beside Max, took an old jacket from her pack, an olive green military jacket, frayed at the cuffs and soaked with sweat from days of patrol, and wrapped it around the dog to protect him from the cold and the damp ground. She stroked Max's head, feeling the dirt-caked fur beneath her hands, and saw his red eyes looking at her with determination. "You did everything to save him, Max," she whispered to herself. "Now it's our turn to take care of you." While the rescue team bandaged Ethan, Max didn't move from his position. The dog lay close to the stretcher, his body pressed tightly against the edge, a living wall between Ethan and the cold winds that blew through the area. Max's legs trembled. The lean muscles that had once made him run like the wind on the trails around the base now cramped from the cold and lack of water. He had no strength left to stand, but he still tried, using his last strength to protect Ethan. The rescue team saw this action, and a feeling of admiration welled up in their hearts. Daniel, the team's medical staff, a man of about 32 years old with short brown hair and strong hands, was bandaging Ethan's left arm and looked up at Max. He shook his head in amazement, thinking to himself, "I've never seen a dog like this." Not only did it save him, but it also protected him until the very end. Ethan, still unconscious, did not know that Max was beside him, protecting him from the cold and wind of the deep forest. He did not feel the faint warmth of Max's thin body, did not hear the dog's panting as he struggled to keep his position. But in his hazy dream, he saw Max, his eyes shining, standing in the middle of the deep forest covered with dry leaves, waiting for him. He felt a strange comfort, as if he knew that the dog would never abandon him. In his heart, though he could not consciously realize it, a warm feeling crept into his mind, as if he knew that he was not alone. The rescue team finished bandaging Ethan, securing his left arm with a makeshift splint made of hard plastic and medical tape, and wrapping a layer of thermal blanket around his body to protect him from the harsh cold. They checked his breathing and pulse, finding them to be somewhat more stable, with the warm saline solution being administered intravenously. But they knew that Ethan needed to be taken back to base immediately, where he could receive proper medical care, and then to a larger military hospital. They loaded Ethan into a military jeep, a vehicle designed for the rugged terrain of the Catskills, with olive green paint and large tires designed to traverse trails covered in wet dirt and loose rocks. The vehicle was covered with a blue tarp to protect it from the wind and cold, and Ethan was placed on a soft mattress to minimize vibrations during the ride. As the rescue team prepared to leave, Max struggled to get up and follow Ethan. The dog shuffled along, legs shaking, his claws leaving small trails of blood in the dirt. He had no strength to walk fast, but he tried, as if he didn't want to leave Ethan's side for even a second. Laura looked at Max, feeling a pang in her heart. She knew the dog needed immediate medical attention, but she also knew that he wouldn't leave Ethan until she was sure he was safe. She knelt down next to Max, stroked his head, and said to Carter, "We need to take Max with us. He can't stay here." Carter nodded, ordering the team, "Put Max in the Jeep next to Ethan. He's done enough. We'll take care of them both." Daniel and Private First Class Ryan Hayes, a young man of 22 with light blonde hair and a cheerful disposition, carefully lifted Max and placed in the Jeep next to Ethan's stretcher. Max didn't protest. He was too weak to do anything but lie down. They wrapped Laura's jacket tighter around Max and placed a small blanket over him to protect him from the cold wind coming through the car door. Max lay close to Ethan, his head resting on the edge of the stretcher, his red eyes looking at him with determination. It had no strength left to bark or move, but it was there, next to Ethan, as if to make sure he was safe. The rescue team set off, the Jeep moving over rough trails, heading for the base 10 miles away, where a medical team was waiting to take Ethan and Max. The cold wind still blew, carrying moisture that clung to the canvas of the vehicle, but inside, Max lay close to Ethan, his thin body radiating a faint warmth. Carter sat in the front, looking back at Max and Ethan, feeling a surge of emotion. He knew that Max's protective actions were more than instinct. They were loyalty beyond all bounds, a deep friendship between a dog and its owner. "If he's alive, it's because of you, Max," he thought. Laura sat next to Max, stroking his head, feeling his weak breathing under her hand. She looked at Ethan, seeing the color slowly returning to his pale face from the saline solution, and she hoped he would wake up. She looked at Max, seeing his red eyes still on Ethan, and she knew that the dog had done all he could. "Thank you, Max," she whispered to herself. "You saved him, and we're going to save you." As the Jeep moved through the Catskills, Max lay there, next to Ethan, a living testament to loyalty and friendship that had endured the cold, the rain, and the danger. After being pulled from a ravine in the Catskills by rescuers, Ethan Sullivan, and Max were loaded into a military Jeep and driven to a temporary base camp 10 miles away. The damp chill of the November morning still hung over the area, with temperatures hovering around 5 degrees Celsius 41 degrees Fahrenheit, and a light breeze was blowing, carrying moisture from the wet ground that clung to the olive-green tarpaulin of the vehicle. Ethan lay unconscious on a stretcher, his face pale with streaks of dried blood on his forehead, his lips dry and cracked, and his broken left arm temporarily immobilized with a plastic pad. And 4 was hooked up to his arm, dripping warm saline solution to counteract his severe dehydration. Max lay next to the stretcher, his emaciated body trembling, his black-brown fur matted with dirt and dry leaves, his red eyes fixed on Ethan with determination. The rescue team, led by Sergeant John Carter, sat around them, eyes a mixture of worry and hope as the vehicle rolled over the rough trails toward the base. The journey back to the base took about 30 minutes, and when the Jeep pulled into the base yard, a large area surrounded by wire mesh fencing and red maple forests, a medical team was waiting. Ethan was rushed into the base's medical shack, a small, corrugated iron-roofed room with wooden walls, containing a few medical beds, a medicine cabinet, and a small heater to alleviate the chill outside. Nurses in olive green uniforms began to assess his condition, diagnosing him with severe dehydration, a broken left arm, and a deep laceration on his forehead. His skin was pale, his breathing was shallow, and his body was shaking despite being wrapped in thermal blankets. They gave him more saline intravenously, put him under a heat lamp to warm him up, and took x-rays with a handheld machine to determine the extent of the damage to his hand. The base doctors decided he needed to be transported to a larger military hospital for treatment, and a U-860 Black Hawk helicopter was called in to take him to the military hospital in Albany, about 100 miles away. Max, meanwhile, was taken to a separate area on the base reserved for working animals. A veterinarian named Sarah, a woman in her mid-30s with tight brown hair and gentle gray eyes, checked on the dog. Max weighed about 70 pounds, nearly 10 pounds less than before the accident, having not eaten or drank anything for 2 days in the cold and rain. His black-brown fur was caked with dirt and dead leaves, his eyes were red, and his claws were bleeding from deep scratches. Sarah checked Max's heart and breathing, finding them weak but steady, and confirmed that the dog was severely weakened by hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. She gave Max fluids through and 4, pumped him with a nutrient solution to replenish his energy, and placed him under a heat lamp to keep him warm in the cool shed. She bandaged the scratches on Max's claws and gently trimmed away the matted fur to clean his body. But Sarah noticed that Max's eyes kept darting toward the medical shed, as if searching for Ethan. The flight from Catskill to Albany took about 25 minutes. Ethan was placed on a medical stretcher in the helicopter's cockpit, wrapped in a thermal blanket, with a small oxygen tube attached to his nose to aid his breathing. Max was placed next to him in a metal transport cage, his emaciated body lying on a soft mattress, his red eyes peering through the metal bars to watch Ethan. The helicopter lifted off into the pale morning light, the roar of the engines drowning out all other sounds, and as they flew over maple forests and low hills, the chill of the Catskills gave way to the warmer air of the plains near Albany. When the helicopter landed at the Albany Military Hospital in mid-morning, the temperature was about 8 degrees Celsius, 46 degrees Fahrenheit, a welcome change from the cold, deep woods Ethan and Max had just left. At the military hospital in Albany, Ethan was admitted to the intensive care unit. He was placed on a medical bed with a metal railing, in a small room with white walls, frosted glass windows overlooking a small garden, and modern medical equipment such as a heart monitor and a backup ventilator. Doctors diagnosed him with severe dehydration, a broken left arm, and a laceration on his forehead that required stitches. They performed minor surgery to fix the arm with a metal rod and splint, and stitched up the laceration on his forehead with 10 medical stitches. An oxygen tube was placed in his nose, and an IV drip hung from a metal rack next to the bed, providing nutrients and pain medication. For the first 2 days, Ethan remained in a coma, his body so weak that doctors feared the damage from dehydration might affect his brain, but they hoped he would wake up as his body recovered. Max was cared for in an animal ward in the hospital, about 20 meters from Ethan's room. Sarah, the veterinarian from the base, accompanied the flight to continue monitoring the dog's condition. Max was placed on a soft cushion examination table in a small room with white walls and a clean tile floor. Sarah gave Max 4 fluids, feeding him small meals of soft, protein-rich foods like ground chicken mixed with rice to help him regain his strength. She cleaned Max's matted fur with warm water and mild soap, bandaged the scratches on his claws, and placed him under a heat lamp to keep him warm in the cool Albany air. Max gradually recovered, his body stopped shaking, and his red eyes began to shine brighter, but his gaze kept looking toward the door, as if waiting for Ethan. On the second day in the hospital, Ethan began to show signs of waking up. He opened his eyes slowly, the white light from the ceiling shining into his eyes, making him blink repeatedly to adjust. He felt a dull ache in his left arm and forehead, but the pain was not as intense as before. He looked around, seeing the white walls, the medical bed, and the 4 hanging beside it. He couldn't remember clearly what had happened, only vague images of the heavy rain, the stifling cold in the crevice, and Max's eyes in his mind. He tried to sit up, but his body was too weak, and a young nurse named Emily, a girl of about 23 with blonde hair tied up and soft blue eyes, quickly came over, placing her hands on his shoulders to keep him down. She told him in a gentle voice that he was saved, that he was in the hospital in Albany, and that he needed to rest. Ethan didn't say anything, but in his mind a single question appeared: where is Max? When Ethan woke up, the rescue team informed Sarah, and she decided to take Max to his room. Max, though still weak, had regained some of his strength under Sarah's care. His fur had been cleaned, the scratches on his claws had been bandaged, and his thin body was no longer shaking. Sarah led Max on a leash through the long corridors of the hospital, with its white tile floors and the smell of antiseptic in the air, to Ethan's room. When the door opened, Max saw Ethan lying on the bed, and his brown eyes were shining weakly but hopefully. The dog shuffled over to the bed, pulling on a leash in Sarah's hand, and placed his head on Ethan's hand. Ethan looked down, saw Max, and felt a surge of emotion. He reached out to stroke Max's head, feeling the soft fur under his hand, and whispered to himself, "You saved me, Max. Thank you." From then on, Max stayed with Ethan throughout his hospital stay. The nurses set up a small mat in the corner of the room for Max, and the dog lay there, never leaving Ethan's side. Every day, Sarah came to check on Max, feeding him small meals and changing the bandages on his claws. Max gradually regained his strength, his fur began to shine again, and his skinny body gradually filled out. But his eyes never left Ethan. Whenever a stranger entered the room, Max stood up, his ears perked up, as if to protect him. Ethan, meanwhile, recovered slowly. He underwent physical therapy to regain strength in his left arm, and although the wound on his forehead had healed, he still felt a dull ache when he moved. He was still weak, but every day he felt better, and he knew that he was alive because of Max. During his days in the hospital, Ethan thought about what had happened. He remembered the heavy rain, the stifling cold in the ravine, and the despair of knowing he would never escape. He remembered the hazy dreams of Max, the dog's eyes shining brightly in the deep, leaf-covered woods. He didn't know exactly what Max had done to save him, but he felt the dog's loyalty in every moment. He looked at Max, saw him lying on the rug in the corner of the room, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. He whispered to himself, "I owe you my life, Max. I will never forget that." The story of Ethan and Max spread through the military hospital in Albany and then to their unit near Catskill. Nurses said that Max never left Ethan's side, that the dog stood up whenever a stranger entered the room, as if to protect him. Doctors said Ethan's survival was a miracle, that he had surpassed the limits of the human body because of Max's will and loyalty. Carter, Laura, and the other rescuers visited Ethan when they were transferred to Albany to report, bringing congratulations and admiration. They told him about Max's loyalty, how he had stood guard at the edge of the ravine for 2 days, leading them to him to save him. Ethan listened, his eyes filling with tears, and he stroked Max's head, feeling the warmth of his body beneath his hands. After 3 weeks in a hospital, Ethan was discharged. He still needed crutches for a few days to help him move because his left arm was not fully healed, but he was well enough to leave Albany. Max, now stronger, walked beside him, his black-brown fur shiny, his ears erect, and his eyes as bright as ever. He left the hospital with a deep sense of gratitude, not just for being alive, but for having Max by his side, a companion who had not abandoned him in his hour of need. He knew that his journey of recovery was not just physical, but also spiritual, and Max helped him find meaning in life again. After 3 weeks of treatment at the military hospital in Albany, Ethan Sullivan was discharged on a mid-December morning in 2024. The air in Albany was cool, with a temperature of about 7 degrees Celsius 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and a light breeze carried the scent of dry leaves from the nearby fields across the military parking lot. Ethan walked out of the hospital building, using crutches on his right arm for the first few days to help him move, his left arm still weak from surgery to stabilize his humerus. He wore a new olive green military jacket given to him by Laura Kim, a thick brown sweater, and dark blue jeans. His face was still pale, with a faint scar on his forehead from a healed laceration, but his green eyes were brighter, shining with a determination and gratitude he had never had before. Beside him, Max walked slowly, his black-brown fur restored from the days of care at the hospital. The 80-pound German Shepherd was now strong, with erect ears and bright brown eyes that sparkled with intelligence and loyalty. Max stayed by Ethan's side, never leaving his side, as if knowing that his mission to protect him was not over. Ethan decided not to return to the Catskills or to continue his military career. After the tragedy of the storm, he realized that his life needed a new direction, one that was not only for himself, but also for Max, the companion who had saved his life. He applied for early retirement from the military, citing his health as no longer fit for active duty, and was granted it after doctors determined that his left-hand injury, though partially healed, will be permanent, leaving him unable to patrol or perform physically demanding tasks. He had no regrets. The military had given him a purpose over the years, but Max had given him a reason to live. He packed his belongings from the base near Catskill his comrades had sent into Albany after the incident, including his father's old backpack, his small folding knife, and the small notebook he'd used to jot down his scattered thoughts, and headed back to Coxsackie, New York, where the family cabin was waiting for him. The journey from Albany to Coxsackie took about 40 minutes, all by car, because Ethan didn't want Max to endure another flight in a transport cage. He rented a gray Chevrolet Malibu in Albany, put Max in the passenger seat, and drove back home through winding roads between fields of grass and maple trees that had lost most of their leaves for winter. Max sat still, his head resting on the seat, his eyes half closed but alert to any sounds outside. Ethan stopped once along the way at a small rest stop, bought himself a sandwich and water, and took some dry food from his pack to give to Max. At each stop, Max got out of the car and walked beside him, ears pricked as if to make sure he was safe. When they reached Coxsackie in the middle of the afternoon, the cool country air greeted them, with a temperature of about 6 degrees Celsius 43 degrees Fahrenheit and pale yellow sunlight filtering through the clouds, illuminating the familiar red dirt roads. Ethan drove through Coxsackie's winding roads, past hayfields and small wooden houses dotted along the road. He stopped in front of the family's old wooden house, a one-story house with a red-tiled roof, weathered wooden walls, and an old fireplace in the living room that he had not repaired since his parents died. The house was just as he remembered it, with a peeling white front door, a small front porch where his mother had kept pots of summer flowers, and a small yard in the back covered with dead leaves from the nearby maple trees. He stepped out of the car, leaning on his crutches, feeling the winter chill seeping through his coat, and looked at the house with a sense of both familiarity and strangeness. Max jumped down after him, standing close by, sniffing the air with his ears perked up, as if checking everything around him for Ethan's safety. Ethan opened the door to the house, stepped inside, and smelled the old wood in the air, mixed with the mustiness from the months of uninhabitation. The living room was the same as before, with a worn brown cloth armchair, a wooden table his father had built himself, and an old, dusty fireplace. He put his father's backpack on the table, took out a family photo of the Hudson River, a keepsake he always carried, and placed it on the wooden shelf next to the fireplace. He sat down in the armchair, feeling tired but relieved, and watched as Max lay down next to him on the wooden floor, his head resting on his forelegs, his eyes shining as if to say it would always be here. He stroked Max's head, feeling the soft fur under his hand, and thought to himself, "I'm home, Max. Thanks for bringing me home." Ethan decided to use his military savings to renovate the cabin in Coxsackie, rather than sell it. He wanted to make it a place where he and Max could live peacefully, not just as a memory of the past, but as a new beginning. He called on an old friend from Coxsackie, Jake, a 30-year-old carpenter he had gone to high school with, to help him with the repairs. Jake, with dark brown hair and rough hands like Ethan's father, came over one afternoon, bringing tools anew to replace rotten floorboards and repair the roof. They worked together for several weeks, painting the walls white, replacing leaky tiles, and building a low wooden fence around a backyard so Max could run around. Ethan and Max moved into the house in late December, when the fields around Coxsackie were covered in a thin layer of winter fog, and the afternoon sun filtered through the bare maple trees, illuminating their small yard. Ethnic and Max walked the dirt roads around Coxsackie every afternoon. Ethan gave up his crutches after a few days as his left arm healed through physical therapy at a small clinic in town, though he still felt stiff with every movement. He walked slowly, taking in the crisp winter air, the scent of dry earth and dead leaves filling his nostrils. Max walked beside him, ears perked, eyes bright, occasionally darting a few steps ahead to sniff the grass along the path or chase a passing squirrel. Ethan looked at Max, feeling a peace he had never felt before. He thought about the days in the Catskills, about the cold patrols in the deep woods, about the heavy rain that almost took his life, and how Max had stood guard at the edge of the ravine for 2 days to save him. He knew that he would never forget Max's loyalty, and he decided to dedicate the rest of his life to caring for the dog who had not abandoned him in his hour of need. The story of Ethan and Max spread through the local community of Coxsackie and Ethan's old military unit near Catskill. Neighbors in Coxsackie, who had known Ethan since he was a child, came to visit him, bringing gifts like homemade cookies and local coffee. They sat in his yard, listening to him tell the story of Max and the loyalty of the dog that had saved his life. They watched Max, now healthy and happy, run around a yard, and felt a deep sense of. In Catskill, Sergeant John Carter, Corporal Laura Kim, and other members of the rescue team retold the story to the new recruits, making Ethan and Max symbols of loyalty and camaraderie within the unit. Carter even offered to award Max a military medal of honor, but Ethan declined in a brief message from Coxsackie, saying that Max didn't need a medal, he just needed him. Max, now 4 years old, lives happily with Ethan in the log cabin in Coxsackie. The dog no longer has to face the harsh cold of the deep woods or the dangers of heavy rain and rugged terrain. Instead, he lives a peaceful life, running around in the yard, lying on the porch while Ethan reads on an old wooden chair, and taking walks with him on the red dirt roads. Ethan cared for Max with all his love and gratitude, feeding him nutritious meals of ground chicken and rice, taking him to the Coxsackie vet regularly, and petting his head every night before bed. He looked at Max, saw the glint in his eyes, and felt that he had found the true meaning of life not in the military missions or the months of running away from Coxsackie, but in the deep friendship with Max. For Ethan, the tragedy in the deep woods was not just a painful memory, but also a profound lesson. He learned that loyalty can overcome all limits, that the friendship between man and animal is a strong, cherished bond. He learned that perseverance can lead to hope, that Max did not give up on him, even when everything seemed hopeless. And he learned that four-legged friends like Max deserve to be loved and cared for, not just because of what they do for us, but because they are a part of our lives. Every time Ethan looks at Max, he whispers to himself, "Thank you, Max. I will never forget what you did for me." Ethan and Max's story ends in peace and happiness, but the lesson from it remains forever. It is a lesson about Max's absolute loyalty, when the dog did not abandon Ethan despite the cold, thirst, and danger. It is a lesson about strong friendship, when the relationship between Ethan and Max overcomes all challenges to become a living testament to the bond between humans and animals. It is a lesson about perseverance leading to hope, when Max stood guard for 2 days to lead the rescue team to save Ethan. And it is a lesson about appreciating four-legged friends, when Max not only saved Ethan and Max lived together in a cabin in Coxsackie, a testament to friendship that transcends all boundaries, a story that four-legged loyalty will forever tell to honor loyal dogs like Max.